Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Would you please welcome Jon Moynihan to give his lecture entitled Reflecting on the Continuing Economic Decline of the West. Jon.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good evening, everybody. So let's take a brisk canter through what I hope you'll find are some interesting and sometimes counterintuitive thoughts. Let me start by asking you to think really quite hard about this question, important for any country, but we're talking about the UK and the West right now. What's going to happen over the next 40, 50, 60, 80 years in this century? Will there be more jobs in this country than before? And will the people in those jobs be earning more for doing the same work than people earn now? Or less? Or what? That's actually the covenant that a government is thought to make to its electorate. We're going to get you more jobs, and you're going to be paid more for those because the standard of living is going to go up and we're all going to be earning more. In fact, for decade after decade, that is what governments managed to do since at least, let's say, the Second World War. So think really hard about that, because imagine yourself back more than 200 years ago. And this is what, for 600 years, if you were lucky enough to own a job, you would have been earning. And this is in 2010 money. You would have been earning less than £2,000 a year on average. Now, just think very hard about what it would be like in this day and age to be earning £2,000 a year. Now, in those days, they didn't have any income tax, so that's all right. You get to keep it all. How far would you get, personally, if that was what you earned? Actually, it's less than £2,000. You can see it was nearer £1,500 a year for the last 3 centuries of that time. For 600 years, wages didn't go up. There are a few more jobs around. I mean, back in 1200, about 10% of the population were actually slaves in the UK. And then above that, there were peasants and things like that. But so there are a few more jobs by the time you get to 1800. But nobody's earning any more. And that's the way it is. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, nobody's earning any more than what they were earning before. And that's the way the world is, always was, always will be. Would any of us like to live in that world? Aren't we lucky that we live in this world? It's a different world than earning £1,700 a year in today's money. Because you couldn't have a car, you couldn't have a bicycle, you couldn't afford to live anywhere. I could just go on with what you couldn't have. And I think you're too smart for me to bang on about that too much. But here's the interesting thing. In the year 1800, wages doubled within 50 years. And then 50 years later, they doubled again. So in 100 years, wages were 4 times as much as what they were 100 years before. Suddenly, this 600 years of nobody making any more had changed dramatically. And then, by the year 2000, wages had doubled again in the next 50 years, and again in the next 50 years. So now, people are earning 16 times as much as they were earning 200 years ago. And suddenly the paradigm had completely shifted, and everybody thinks, oh, I'm going to earn more and more. Every year, my wages are going to go up, because they always have in living memory. And what's more, the number of jobs goes up. It goes from 18 million to 32 million in the UK over a little more than 100 years. So there are going to be more and more jobs, isn't that great? And we're going to be earning more and more and more just for doing the same work, just for doing the same work, lots more. In fact, the paradigm since the Second World War is that jobs would go up about 2% a year and wages would go up about 3% a year. Jolly nice. And that's sort of my right as a citizen. Well, it wasn't anybody's right as a citizen for 600 years. So what happened differently? What happened differently was capitalism. Very, very straightforward. Lots of things happened. The Enlightenment happened. The scientific revolution happened. The Industrial Revolution happened. But it was all predicated on capitalism. what capitalism was about was that there were some rich people who had some money. They had spare money. And they invested that money in new businesses, new technologies, new science, and suddenly you got this job explosion, and suddenly everybody was earning a great deal more. And people tell you it was the trades union movement or something, whatever, that did it. No, it's capitalism. Capitalism did this. Now, the question is, have we got capitalism anymore, or have we got something else? If we still have capitalism, so that wages can quadruple again this century, then the average wage in 2100 in 2010 money will be around £100,000 a year. I think we can believe that if we accomplish that, almost all our troubles are behind us. Well, let's look at the reality of the 2000s. Wages are going down, and the number of jobs is going down. Here's the United States. There's still 2 million less jobs than there were in 2007 in the States. And meantime, the population has grown by 15 million. Now, that's a sort of just a nice little theoretical chart for us to look at. That's millions and millions and millions of people who have not had a job since 2007. And it's the same here. The paradigm, as I said, jobs going up 2% a year, wages going up 3% a year. That was the paradigm since the Second World War. Paradigm now is that job growth is negative and wages are going down. And you saw at the party political conferences in the last few days, or last couple of weeks, everybody talking about, oh, inflation is going up faster than my wages, my standard of living is going down. Now, what if that is the paradigm? What if that is the way we're going to be for the next 50 years? Because we have no God-given right to have the left-hand paradigm work. We have to understand what are the causes of the old paradigm and the causes of the new paradigm. Why is it, now this is a complicated chart, why is it that what I'm talking about is essentially what I call a Western phenomenon, a phenomenon of the developed countries? The pink and the red countries are those that are growing less than 2% a year, sometimes zero. You can see up at the, some of these bright red countries, there's Iran and Spain and Italy and Greece, and there are a couple of little things like French Guiana and so forth. But virtually the whole of the West, pop your eyes over to Japan, that's not growing either. Why is it that they're not growing and the rest of the world is growing really quite fast, particularly Africa, particularly China, particularly a whole bunch of other similar countries, which of course we should all be extremely pleased about, because some of those countries people live in abject poverty. So it's absolutely terrific that they're growing fast. But why is the whole of the Western world doing so badly? Well, I'm offering, this is an era of inflation. And so there are normally 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I've got 6 because inflation has taken us from 4 to 6. I'm offering you 6 horsemen of the West apocalypse, and I'm going to try and go through them quite quickly. Wagner's law, Jensen's hypothesis, the machine's victory, extractive groups, Keynes economics, and Crosland's revenge. 6 things I believe that have turned the paradigm from positive to negative. Let's look at Wagner's law. I'm hoping that none of you have heard of Wagner's law. Wagner, this Wagner, not the Meistersinger Wagner. This Wagner, he was in 1863. He propounded his law. He said basically that in a democratic economy, government's going to get bigger and bigger. You're just not going to stop it. The voters are going to demand that government give them more and more. And for him to say that in 1863 was, I thought, really quite smart. And it's, well, you can look it up on Wikipedia. Everybody talks about Wagner's law. But it has some profound implications. Here's the UK over that century when wages were growing and jobs were growing, from the UK government growing from between 10 and 15% of the economy to 50% of the economy in the last few years. That's a massive change. Wagner's law says that's because of democracy. People are going to demand that they get more and more from government, and this will be seen, if you look at it objectively, as government bribing the electorate to vote for them. And there's a very funny phrase that somebody came up with, which was, with universal suffrage, it becomes impossibly expensive to bribe all of the electorate. To which we could add, but they're trying, they're trying. There's some people, Connors and Norton, who have said, well, what do you really need a government to do? Things like sewage, important stuff to keep society going. That's somewhere between about 13, 14, 15% of GDP. That's necessary. You'll notice I've got education there, I haven't got health there. There are some libertarians who say you don't have to have education. I think that's a bit silly, but health is obviously a bit more. So you could say there are other things than that list you want, and maybe you have to get up to 30% to have a government that anybody would find acceptable in this day and age. But here's the trouble. As soon as you go above, government being above 25% of the economy, your economic growth starts diving down. And by the time you get to 60%, you're hardly growing at all. Whereas if you're only at 25%, your economy is growing at 7%. And there are lots of jobs, and those jobs are paying more. But we're all up in the, as I showed you in the previous chart, the UK at 50%. Taxes are only about 40%, which means that we're borrowing 120 billion a year because we're spending 50%. But as soon as you get up to that, you ain't growing. And this is based on something like 60 different data points as to what happens when government grows. What size of government is best for keeping our economy growing? Well, if you've only got a government that's at 12 to 25% of GDP, then 1/8 to 1/4 of all earnings have to be confiscated from people annually in order to pay for that. At a quarter of the economy, then for every government worker, you've got 3 workers slaving away to give the money that's needed for that government worker. And at 12%, only you've got 7 workers slaving away to support 1 government employee. So the economic activity will flourish. People can stand to have that taken off them, particularly because government does good things, sewage, police, whatever, and that's fine. However, if government is 50% of GDP, as it is in many, many Western economies, then 1/2 of all earnings must be confiscated. And that has to be done quite skillfully. I think it was Colbert who said, the art of taxation is to pluck the goose without making it hiss too much. But when it's 50%, the amount of taxes that you have to invent, and you have to invent a new one every couple of months just to sort of try and get the money, because the moment you've invented it, people sort of try and find ways of avoiding it. Income tax, obviously, national insurance, property tax, inheritance tax, corporate tax rates, value-added tax, fuel tax, road tax, speeding, parking fines, airport tax, alcohol tax, tobacco tax, BBC license fee. All of these are taxes. The plastic bag tax. My secretary came back to me and said, oh, no, you're wrong, John, about that. Plastic bag tax isn't a tax. They're giving the money to charity. I said, it's a tax. They're taking it from you. They're taking it from you. All of these things are taxes, and they have to invent more and more taxes in order to get the money that they need to pay for this gigantic government. Now, then they'll still run out of new tax dodges, and then they have to borrow the money. And that works for a while, but we'll see what happens in a while, because it doesn't, in a few slides' time, it doesn't work forever. And economic activity slumps under this kind of regime. This is just factual. You can come up with all sorts of reasons why having a government of this sort is important. I'm just pointing out the counterpoint that your economy will not grow, jobs will not grow, wages will go down. This was an inevitable consequence, which we saw on that big map of the world earlier. of this kind of approach to the size of the economy. And it's really important to understand, in order for the government to keep going, it has to get the money from somewhere. And let's all agree for a moment that you can't borrow it forever. So the only place you can get it is from taxes. Where do you get the taxes? Well, if you're going to get economic growth, then you've got to look to small business, because big companies don't actually grow. They may acquire other companies and grow that way, but mostly they're sort of rationalizing, reducing costs, becoming more efficient. And big companies do not provide job growth. It's the small companies, it's the entrepreneurs, the so-called SMEs, who provide jobs. So the new jobs come from new companies. Now, in order to attract investment and then to survive, these companies have to make profits. They've got to be profitable. Otherwise, they go bust. A government can go on forever because it just prints money to keep going. But a company in the private sector has to make money in order to survive. And when it does, then it can pay taxes to the government. And the government then gives that tax money to its employees, its suppliers, its populace, its beneficiaries. And now you've got a machine that works. So let's see what's necessary to make that work, the preconditions for that. Well, new companies are only created from capital. Rich people are needed to provide the capital. Unfortunately, you've got to have rich people. This is how capitalism works. The alternative has been tried in 80 countries around the world and failed in every single one. So there is no known alternative to this way of creating jobs and getting out of that 600-year pre-capitalist environment that I was talking about earlier. So you need rich people. There you go. It's really, and to attract the investment and help the companies make profits, it's really important not to impose large social, energy, tax, employee costs on these companies. Because the more costs you impose on them, the more likely they are to go bust. And then they won't make profit, then they won't pay tax, and then you haven't got a growing economy. So you need to carefully minimize the costs of social and other initiatives. Otherwise, these companies will never get off the ground. Or if they do get off the ground, it's because they're in China or India or somewhere else, but not here. It's really important to make it much more attractive for people to be employed and pay taxes than it is to be unemployed drawing benefits. Because I'll tell you quite frankly, when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, I was the laziest son of a gun you've ever come across. And I really liked to lie in bed. And it was only sort of when I eventually, reached bottom that I figured out, oh, well, actually, you have to go to work and, work quite hard and in order to make money. And I think it perfectly logical to lie in bed if you're being paid about the same amount to do that as it is to go off and work quite hard from 9 to 5. So you need low corporate and employment taxes, not too high benefits, because if you tax an employed person too much, it is actually, for many, many people, just as interesting and just as profitable to be unemployed. And finally, if the government is going to give that money to its employees, its suppliers, and its populace, and you don't want that to be too much, it's important for the government to spend less than it gets, to be efficient, to be as small as possible, and thus encourage private sector growth. So you need a small government, back to Wagner's law. And how do you break Wagner's law? Remember, 1863 he came up with this. It's been going for quite a long time. How do you break that law? Okay, now it's back to this point about being rich. You get people like Nick Clegg saying you've got to get tough on irresponsible and unjustified top remuneration. It's a sort of rich bashing. Who said, anybody tell me who said to get rich is glorious? Or who's reputed to have said it? Well, he actually didn't say it, but he's reputed to have said it. Deng Xiaoping said to get rich is glorious. And it's quite funny to sort of see here we are, supposed to be a capitalist country, getting counterfactual by Deng Xiaoping. Okay, that's Wagner's law. How do you get the size of government down and get government out of interfering with the way companies are run in order to allow them to grow and be successful? Let's go to Jensen's hypothesis, which is one of the most powerful things that the West is suffering from. He said globalization leads to massive jobs transfer from West to East and eventual wage equilibration. Two very important points. He came up with that idea, by the way, in 1993. As you leave, there's a sort of reading list of all of these things. If you want to take a card and look them up on the internet, he gave a very interesting presidential address. 1993, 20 years ago. Here's what he said. Look at the first black column. The advanced economies have about 500 million people working in them. This is the West. And they make about $135 a day each. The developing economies in their cities have 1.1 billion, over twice as many people, earning about $12 a day on average. Now, you know, in places like Bangalore, you're up to $35 a day. It's still a fraction of what's earned in the West. Waiting to urbanize in the country, in India, China, Indonesia, wherever you like, there's another 1.3 billion people who are just desperate to get a decent job, and they're earning very often less than $1 a day. Less than $1 a day. So the ones on the far right are going to keep the pressure on the ones in the middle not to earn too much, because if the ones in the middle all demand lots more wages, then they'll just get fired, because you don't have very strong employment law in China or whatever, and they'll just bring in more people from the country. Now that's an enormous difference in cost. That says, why should we in the West feel that we have the right to earn $135 a day when over in the developing countries, people are earning so much less, would actually benefit so much more from the job because they have no social safety net or whatever. And for the last 20 years, this bottom red arrow, people have said this, and in general, politicians and economists have said, well, it's not really a problem. We'll sort of grow jobs. You know, you always find someone else. People said that about farms. You know, it used to be 90% of the people in the Western world worked on farms, and now it's only 10%, so what the hell? But while people were poo-pooing that, tens of millions of jobs were migrating and continue to migrate from west to east. And this is a major problem for us. It's a major good news thing for developing countries, major problem for the Western countries. So your paradigm, 1955, of the biggest company in the world was General Motors. It had about 500,000 workers in the United States, and it had about 60,000, 70,000 workers elsewhere in the world. They made their cars there. The steel that they made their cars with was made there. Everything was in the United States. Now Apple, which coincidentally has about the same market value on an equilibrated basis now as General Motors had, biggest company in the world now, has about 30,000, 40,000 employees in the States and 700,000 contractors around the world. That's the reality. We no longer have the reality of the 50s, 60s, 70s. It's a new world. Back to capital and capitalism. In order to grow an economy, you've got to invest your capital. China is up to almost 50% of GDP being invested right now. A lot of it really foolishly, a lot of it, you know, in disastrous investments. Doesn't really matter, because a whole bunch more is going into good investments, whereas ours is declining. Is now around 15% of our GDP. And if you don't invest capital, you don't get new jobs. So in the old days, and just before I get to that slide, there's a brilliant thing going on, which I think was one of Britain's greatest exports. And here I am speaking sarcastically. If you remember, when we decolonialized, which would be from about 1947, when India and Pakistan got their freedom, through to the mid-60s, the prevailing view in the world was that of basically Fabian socialism, although we came to call it Butscalism in this country, because both the Conservatives under Butler, who was their chief theoretician, and Labour under Gates School, who was their chief theoretician, basically had the same view. which was that a lot of socialism was good. Remember, it wasn't until Thatcher came along that you denationalised, that you privatised a whole bunch of industries. We had lots of nationalised industries in the UK. And after the war, after the Second World War, we sent a whole bunch of economists out from the London School of Economics to India and said, well, what you want is Fabian socialism. You want to have a centralised government, lots of nationalisation, an economy directed by the government as to where investment should be. That's the way to go. So as a result, India stagnated until 1992, when Manmohan Singh came along and liberalised the Indian economy. So that was brilliant for us because we had basically managed to keep India from competing with us for nearly half a century. Now, over in China, it was of course much, much worse because they'd gone from Fabian socialism to actual extreme communism, Maoism, and they did far more foolish and futile things in China. But again, it stopped them from competing from us. So the West had a free hand because they'd persuaded credulous developing countries that Fabian socialism was a great idea, which it wasn't. It was terrible, and it was bad for everybody. But in any event, what happened, of course, in 1992 or so was everybody got wise, and they said, oh, this capitalism idea seems to be the right way to go. And so all over the world, capitalism started, and now we've got some real competition, and we're failing against that competition. Let's look at what we could do to stop this. Could we have competitive wage rates? No, it's totally unfeasible. We've already gone that. $135 a day pays $10 a day. Existing physical and intellectual capital base. The half-life is some 10, 15 years, so that's going away. And meantime, the developing countries are developing their own physical and intellectual capital base. Propensity to invest new capital, you just saw, that's vanishing, and developing countries are creating far more capital themselves. Encouragement of venture capitalists and entrepreneurs. That Western actually, there's some really good things going on in this country. Young kids are much more entrepreneurial than they were before, and that's one of the big hopes we have for our country. But in general, this Western hostility to high earners is fairly catastrophic for the development of capitalism. Existing intellectual property is being stolen at the most astounding rate through cyber theft and through state-sponsored cyber theft, particularly by China. That this has been so well documented, I don't need to go into that. And the ability to generate intellectual property is being destroyed by our collapsing educational setup. At UWE here, 80% of graduate students are from overseas. And I think that's fantastic, and I hope you love being here and are learning stuff. But the majority of you are probably going to go home. How are we going to, in 25 years, have even the teachers to teach the next lot of students if all we're doing is using our educational system as a way of making money, as a commercial enterprise, to attract overseas students, give them a great education, but what has that done for UK PLC? And by the way, 60% of all STEM students, science, technology, education, medicine, all STEM graduate students across the entire United Kingdom come from overseas, and most of them will go back again. And that's great. They'll do great things when they go back to wherever they go back. Some of them will stay, and that'll be great for us. But it's not great that we are not, we haven't even got the young kids coming up through our educational system who can come to a school like this. We haven't got enough of them who can come to a school like this because our education all the way down is so bad. And I'll bang on about education for longer than I should. Right, okay, so the trend's going to, there's going to be an equilibration of wages. Is going to go down, I think, to about $60, which means that people will be earning about half in this country what they're earning now on a real basis. And by the way, it could get worse. There's no reason why it has to stay that way. Go back to 600 years of lousy wages. Unless we do the right things, there's no reason why we can prevent it. And the way it happens is inflation and currency collapse. And we'll get into how inflation and currency collapse happen. Remember the party political conferences all saying, oh, inflation's going up higher than wages are. We're earning less. Ain't seen nothing yet. Ain't seen nothing yet. That's just minor. Okay, third one. The machine's victory. So a really great book called The Race Against the Machine by Bernolfson and Andy McAfee at MIT. They say machines are substituting increasingly for man. The internet is obviously the biggest jobs killer, but look at the header. Taxi drivers are gone within 15 years. You'll have autonomous cars. Truck drivers, they've already got pilot schemes out in Sweden where there are 10 autonomously driven trucks barreling down the motorway at 60 miles an hour. Football referees, you know, artificial intelligence is much better at spotting even dives and things like that, football referees. Translators, soldiers, you know, that's very important for a country because, you know, a certain demographic gets to go into the army nowadays. Soldiers are all going to be robots, you know, within a certain amount of time. Equity analysts, actuaries, political pundits. Computers do a better job than all of these right now. University professors, you all know about MOOCs. I thought I put those in, you know, larger letters there. You all know about MOOCs, massively online courses. Would you rather do a massively online course at very low cost from the best professor in the world, or would you rather have much more expensive education? That's a big challenge for the universities. EE 101, Electronic Engineering 101, the MOOC from MIT had 135,000 people studying it last year from all over the world. 15-year-olds from Mongolia acing it. The top student at MIT taking that same course would have come 50th. You know, the top 49, in other words, were ones taking the MOOC, and some of them were 15 years old. So that all over, there's going to be a massive shift in jobs over the next 20, 30 years. And again, the people who are going to suffer the most are the least educated, but this is going to hit every tier of education. And the people are going to have to absolutely reinvent what jobs are and what jobs people can do as the machine, as the computer becomes more and more clever, more and more humanoid, more and more able to take jobs away. And they are right now. Oxford Martin School estimated that 45% of existing jobs in the US will be gone because they've been automated in the next 20 years. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but maybe it's not. Extractive groups. This is one that got me very favorable mentions on the Occupy Wall Street website when I had an early version of this. Because I talked about bankers and CEOs, but it's actually a disparate set of people who are, there's a great book, Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail, which I strongly recommend to everybody. It goes back to Venice and talks about how the Venetian Empire collapsed because some people got hold of that empire and started to extract all the profits out of it and thus prevent new entrepreneurs coming into the system and making money. Bankers, CEOs, public sector workers, entitlement beneficiaries, and the silver generation, that's me and some of us here in the room, are all taking too much out of this economy. I would submit to you. Bankers, the amount of profits plus compensation that bankers have taken out of the economy has gone from 1.5% of the GDP to something like 7%. Since about 1941. It goes up and down. 1910, bankers are earning the same as anybody. By 1930, they're earning 30% more. And then suddenly, they're not. And then suddenly again, 1990, 2000, they're earning much more than other jobs. Why is that? Really great book that I think is on the reason it's called Once in Golconda, talks about the 1930s. And it's the same players, the same people, the same things happening there as happened 50 years later. Because what happened was the wages went down because these red bars were all these laws that you can't read because the type's too small, but they put in place to stop bankers mucking about, right? And then in 1980, 1990, 2000, they took all those laws away again. And suddenly bankers are able to extract more out of society than you might have thought was appropriate. They're just beginning to put in new laws against Sarbanes-Oxley, but I would argue that they're not very useful. So the financial sector, a very important sector, hugely important for this country, is nonetheless extracting too much out of the economy, and that strangles the other parts of the economy. Here's a little chart, you can't really read it, but the black things across the top are the things that are causing these extracted profits to happen. And the color code is, are we doing anything about it? And the green says, yes, we're doing something about it. Yellow, sort of, but it's not really working. Red is, no, we're not doing anything about it. Sorry, I haven't got time, but take it from me, we're not doing an awful lot about, partly because we're afraid of destroying the city, which would be a very stupid thing to do. Next lot of extractive people, CEOs, they used to earn about 25 to 35 times as much as the lower paid worker in their own company. Now they're earning 200-300 times as much. And that's the fault of the remuneration committees, which are often composed of other CEOs. And I would argue it's really not necessary. And it's societally very damaging, because people think that CEOs, and I'm an executive chairman, they think they're automatically fat cats, and you know, they're just sitting there taking lots of money, and that's why other people haven't got much money. Actually, if you knocked all these back down to 25 times, it wouldn't create that much more money for everybody else. But it's damaging, and I would argue it's wrong, and it's been wrong for 20 years. And before that, it wasn't happening, as you can see from this chart. Public sector workers are earning much more than private sector workers. The red bars, there's one exception I'll get to, the red bars are how much more they're earning on salary. But on top of the salary, they're getting these pensions, which are absolutely fabulous, and mean that when you add that to the red bar, they're earning way, way more than private sector workers. And that's wrong, because you actually want people to be in the private sector creating jobs and paying real taxes. The one exception, of course, is public sector workers with degrees. We pay them less so as to make sure we don't have really smart people running the public sector. Go figure. Welfare costs. Welfare recipients are just getting more and more out of the economy. Here in the UK, when the problems of the early 1990s were solved, welfare spending should have shot down. It didn't. It stayed up, and then, of course, as soon as you get the financial crisis of 2008, it shoots up a lot more. What you've done is institutionalize welfare spending. And the point is, then people think that government is the answer. Entitlements as a percentage of government's total outlays just go shooting up. Percentage of US population living in a household receiving some government benefit goes up to about 50%. It's the same here. People think, well, I pay my taxes, I should be getting something back from the government. Well, no. What we want to do is most people get nothing from the government, and therefore they don't have to pay so much taxes, and therefore they can spend their own money the way they want to, the way they think is best, not the way government thinks is best. So, you know, and it's infantilizing the population to think that government's the answer, rather than that we are the answer. If you look at the far right, welfare is the least good thing you can do with government money. The good things to do is education and infrastructure. Those are the things that do actually have a positive, significant positive effect on the economy. And of course, you know, when you've got 80,000 people in HMRC taking your money, and then another 120,000 giving it back to you, you start to wonder what the hell is going on. And by the way, you know, a few people managing the economy and a few people stopping climate change and so forth. You know, what is this? DWP, £3.5 billion a year of salaries. Silver generation, Wagner's Law triumphant, you know, free bus passes, winter fuel allowance for every person over whatever it is, 65. It's just silly. It's magical thinking that we've got this money. You know, magical thinking means thinking something will happen by magic, and it won't. Okay, Keynes's economics. This is one of the real problems about the way economies are run right now, is that it is now accepted universally by the media, by the government, by the commentariat, by the academy, that Keynes had the answer. And I will argue that Keynes has been one of the most pernicious things, Keynesian thinking, or at least Keynesian thinking as it is currently interpreted. Keynes probably wouldn't have agreed with what is being done in his name. What happens is any kind of economic downturn has led to the system being flooded with money. And any kind of hint that there may be a problem with the economy has led to more being flooded with money. We've seen Janet Yellen elected to be governor of the Federal Reserve today. She is believed to be very accommodationist and very happy to flood the economy with even more quantitative easing. Let's have a little timeline. It starts off with one of the most important remarks made in the last century by anybody, by Richard Nixon of all people, who everybody thinks as a capitalist villain. He said, "We're all Keynesians now." That is to say, Keynes had won the argument. And actually, the nice thing was that a few years later, Paul Volcker in 1979 said, "You must be joking," and interrupted the triumphant march of Keynesianism for just a few years. And the only two politicians in the Western world who have denied Keynes and said it's a bad idea were, interestingly, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who both actually understood a lot more about economics than people think. They both would wave the book of Hayek and the Austrian economists and say, "This is what we believe in." Hayek famously lost the argument to Keynes, partly because he was an Austrian with a very bad English accent who nobody could understand. He was also a bit short-tempered. He was also a bit absent-minded, so he wasn't the greatest exponent for his ideas. But interestingly, both Reagan and Thatcher, nobody else said that he knew what he was doing. So back you go to 1987. There's a massive drop in the stock market, and Alan Greenspan pours a huge amount of money into the economy. And that became known as the Greenspan put. And for the next 20 years that he was chairman of the Federal Reserve, every time there was a problem, he would put more money into the system. How exactly did that work out? Well, I think you actually know. So now in the 1990s, you've got an institutionalization of easy money. And between 1990 and 2008, this Greenspan put gives you a series of monetary easings and a very significant growth in the money supply. At the same time, precisely as predicted by Hayek in papers he wrote in the late 1920s, very important to understand that, all of this was predictable and predicted. The auditors signed off on totally ridiculous financial reports. Politicians, because of Wagner's Law, kept the whole thing going because it was great to get more votes by pouring more money into the economy. You get these absurd ratings from the ratings agencies where they give AAA to pieces of junk that later turned out to be worthless. And then, at the same time, therefore, you've got a growth in the number of banks eager to lend. You've got massive growth in borrowing by individuals, companies, and secondary financial institutions. And most of the prudent bankers get fired, all precisely as Hayek predicted. He said, this is how it works. The money goes from the government to the banks. The bank lends imprudently because there's so much money they don't know what to do with it. And it works out fine, and the people who've lent imprudently get promoted. And the people who said, no, we shouldn't really lend money like that, they all get fired and go off to be taxi drivers. For now, obviously, they'll get fired when the automated car comes on soon. But now you've got banks that are full top to bottom with people who don't know how to lend prudently. So what happens then? Enormous rise in banks' balance sheet, significant increase in spending and GDP, massive rise in reported bonuses for the bankers, and a major rise in standard of living for everybody. We're all much richer. Why? Because we're living on borrowed money. If you borrow a bunch of money, you can live a lot better than you're living now. You won't be able to pay it back. It will go bad in the end. But meantime, you know, Mr. McCorber-like, you're going to be very, very happy. As the whole of the Western world was throughout the 2000s, or the early 2000s. We're all, you know, our standard of living is great. And now when people say, oh, we've got to keep the standard of living up, they're basically saying we've got to carry on being Mr. McCorber. And I assume you all know what happens then. So there's a major increase in debt among individuals and banking in particular, and that which could not go on did not go on. That's Herb Stein's formulation. If something can't go on forever, it won't. So you get all the housing defaults, the AIG, Northern Rock, Lehman, almost all mortgage lenders in the US and the UK all go bust. And now you've got policy schizophrenia. Let's attack the banks for it being their fault. No, Hayek said it's the government's fault for putting all this money into circulation, which the banks then screw up their lending of. And at the same time, we're very nice to the banks because we've got to keep them going. So bankers get all the bailout money, which we then have to pay for. Ask Ireland, which has been condemned to 30 years of poverty because they bailed out the banks instead of letting them go bust, which I believe they should have. So we talk tough against the banks, but at the same time, with QE, fat margins to build our capital base, no dismemberment of the banks, no separation and ring fencing of the intermediation part of banking from the casino part of banking, we're completely schizophrenic about it. What we say and what we do, two different things. So, not so great. So, actually, for today's neo-Keynesians, there's never a good time to run a surplus. It's always a deficit, except at the very beginning of the late 90s and early 2000s in the UK and in a couple of years in the United States. But very quickly we start spending more money and we're off to the races again. Everybody says we should spend our way out of this problem. How? How? Because you're just building up more and more debt. The total debt, United Kingdom, very high. Ireland, you see, is just in dreadful state now that it's saved its banks. The red is what people say is the debt of these countries. The red plus the grey is their true debt. The real national debt in the UK, we've got a whole bunch of things that are off balance sheet that absolutely dwarf our stated debt. And our stated debt is currently about 80% of GDP, and it'll be around 100% of GDP by the time we get to the end of this Parliament. The Queen said, when she visited the Bank of England, well, why didn't anybody predict this? And everybody said, I don't know, Your Majesty, you know, it was a total shock to us. That's because they're all Keynesians. This chap, Dirk Biesemer, came up with a list of all the people who did actually, in various papers, predict it. And then he said, and this is the model they used. Now see that thing on the left? The green and the blue stuff on the right is a Keynesian input-output model. Stuff on the left is what Hayek adds into it. Hayek predicted all of this back in the late 20s and early 30s. And they said, if you put in that model, the model of what the banks do when you flood the system with money, then you can predict the kind of collapse that happened. So it was predictable, it was predicted by some, but if you adopt a Hayekian approach in just about any university in this country, in America, or whatever, you're kicked out. Students are actually told, if you do not adopt a Keynesian framework in your finals, when you write your finals essay papers, you'll be marked down. And I think it's one of the most catastrophic things. Here are all the things that you or should you not do. The neo-Keynesian will say yes. I assert that Keynes wouldn't have particularly agreed it. Milton Friedman's disciples sort of go halfway along with the Keynesians on some things but not on others. And Hayek says, no, no, no. Do not do these things. It'll just make things worse. There will be a further crash, at which you argue that we have to pour in even more money. But the crash is because of your Keynesian or neo-Keynesian policies. You can see this little cycle of government spending on a deficit, so debt goes up, so interest payments go up, so you need more money. Bit by bit, the banks on the left overeager to lend to bad credits. Keynesian monetary tactics like QE, temporary lower interest rates, which makes it worse. You know, lend to buy makes it worse. Flooding the punishing savers and rewarding borrowers makes it worse. Deficits are suddenly massive. The pain of restructuring becomes increasingly impossible with every iteration. People start defaulting. The doom loop accelerates. So that thing starts going faster and faster. You've got a liquidity crisis, and you've got what I call Greece goes to Argentina. Argentina, the 10th richest nation in the world in 1900. In the world, an unbelievably rich country is now one of the poorest countries in the world, because this is what they did for a century. And we've only been doing it for 30 years, but we're doing it much more aggressively and happily, so we can get to that impoverished state much quicker if we carry on. And by the way, reversing QE, can't go into this chart, haven't got the time, could be a total disaster. Last one, Crosland's revenge. He said, Tony Crosland said, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to destroy the effing grammar school in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And he did. Didn't even pass a law, just signed a ministerial diktat. And as a result, you had 750 grammar schools in 1960, and in 2012 you got 100, well, you got a little bit more. No, I think you got 100 grammar schools. And even more important, you've tripled the size of all schools. So now 900 pupils per school instead of 300, which means that they're soulless places that nobody can manage in. So you've taken all the bright people and condemned them to just awful education. And by the way, of course, you haven't done what the Germans do, which is to have technical schools where people can learn trades and skills, where a whole bunch of pupils will be much more suited and much more enjoy that than having to learn dry academic stuff. So now we've got the situation where 2 out of 5 UK school leavers aren't getting C or higher in English or maths, and therefore they're completely unsuited for the modern economy. And since 1963, unless you've got an undergraduate degree, basically you're earning the same as what you're earning before. You've got a graduate degree, you're doing very fine, well done. Or you who are going to get graduate degrees. So, 6 horsemen who collectively, I would argue, are destroying Western economies. There are reasons to be cheerful. There's this huge explosion of technologies. There's a huge explosion in IQ. The average young person has got an IQ 20 points higher than when I was a young person. I was talking at MIT the other day, where I went, and the year I went, I got the highest score on the entrance exam. That score is now 1 standard deviation below the average of students going on the same course as I went to. We don't know why this is, but it's a fact. It may be because they've taken lead out of the air. No kidding. But who knows why? Teaching is getting better. Motivated immigrants are helping this country like crazy, thank goodness. But this bottom thing, the Kurzweilian, everybody knows Kurzweil, The Singularity Is Now, very good book. Don't know if I got it on my reading list. You could quickly write down 100 different technologies that are going to transform the world. And the COD phrase is bio, nano, info, neurocogno, anticarbo. All of these technologies could transform the world. And in fact, I see the cities of Britain, like Bristol, as playing a hugely important part in this. They're at the bottom, number 1, IP creation. So a whole bunch of things you can do to help in the creation of mostly scientific intellectual property in the academy. Then move on to 2, which is exploiting it by seeding all around the university engineering centers, innovation centers, incubators, business science parks. And then on the right, IP financing, we're back to our rich people. Cities are doing very well about here are like Cambridge, where they're the famous 30 secret millionaires who are funding all sorts of stuff in Silicon Fen. And they keep themselves very quiet, but they funded a whole bunch of new companies. It's the same, to some extent, in Oxford. There's an Oxford mafia who do rather the same, but they haven't been quite as successful as the Cambridge ones. What you need is a bunch of rich people here in Bristol to take the intellectual property that's coming out of the academy and turn that into real businesses. But with all sorts of things to help the financing of intellectual property. And the government's doing some good things, you know, EIS schemes, if anybody, you know what that are, and so forth. But in the end, because our deficit is 120 billion a year, which we've got to get rid of, and because there's a whole bunch of things we're not doing, like financing IP, we probably need about 200 billion a year in order to turn this baby around. And I think it is turnable around, so long as you get education right. A billion here, a billion there won't do it. It's interesting, if you look at a list, you'll have your pet fantasy of what the government shouldn't be doing. Here's a list of things that very quickly add up to 120 billion pounds a year that this economy could get. Eliminate the compensation culture. The NHS pays out 2 billion a year for people who have had a problem with the NHS. The thing is, these people might need it, but I don't think it's government's job to do that. And the compensation culture could probably, if you eliminated it from government and gave sovereign immunity to all government departments, you could probably save about 10 billion a year, right there. People tripping over paving stones on the street and suing the local council. Sorry, we got sovereign immunity, don't do it. 10 billion a year. Get rid of that magical thinking where somehow we think we've got the money to do that. Homeopathy and other quack science would save £500 million a year of stuff that makes absolutely no sense. Magical thinking that homeopathy will solve your medical problem any more than a placebo pill will. Defund cosmetic operations and procedures from the NHS. If you want lipo or you know, eye surgery or whatever you want, sorry, we haven't got the money, £500 million a year. Reform government procurement. To buy less and to do it with less people could save at least £20 billion a year for the government, for all the things that they buy. Reform public sector pensions, that was what I talked about before, at least 15 billion a year could be saved there if we put people on the same kind of pensions that most of the rest of the private sector have. Means you're not going to have a great retirement, but why should the private sector fund great retirements for the public sector? Remove all welfare payments for people earning over £100,000. That's been estimated at £5 billion a year. So if you earn over £100,000 a year, sorry, you can't have winter fuel allowance, you can't have free bus pass, you can't have free school meals for your children, you can't have anything, because you don't need it. It's magical thinking to think that it's appropriate to spend money on that. Sock puppet, there are 27,000 sock puppet advocacy charities who get paid by the government to advocate policies that the government want advocated. That's why they're known as sock puppets. Just get rid of it. And if you get rid of 1/3 of them, you save £5 billion a year. These are charities that you hear on the radio asking you to do this, that or the other. And they're being funded by the government to do that. It's just silly. Reform the quangos. Get rid of 1/6 of those, and you've saved 10 billion a year. Eliminate the BBC licence fee. 10% of all prosecutions in public courts in this country for people who fail to pay their licence fee. Where's the sense in that? But just take it out of tax. You say, BBC, you can have this much money, pay it out of tax. You know, what you could save just by eliminating all the stupidities that are around the licence fee. You save maybe £250 million a year. Regulate and legalise marijuana so that people who work in the marijuana industry pay taxes, and people who smoke marijuana pay taxes. Now, this bird has flown for anybody who thinks that it isn't going to happen. It's now legal in several states in America, Colorado, Washington, and so forth, and all the other states are looking, my God, they're making hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes from this, and their crime rate has dropped precipitously. Right? So this bird has flown. This, I would argue, is going to happen. It's just a case of how long we want to go on being foolish and sacking Professor Nutt when he says it ought to be legalized because he's just seen this through. So how long is that going to take? I don't know, but I estimate it could make this country $20 billion a year in taxes, reduced crime, stopping paying benefits to people who work in the marijuana industry because they say they're unemployed and claim benefit. Instead, just let them get a proper salary and pay taxes on it. Eliminate all wind farm subsidies, $5 billion a year. Some of you dislike me for saying that. Exploit shale gas more aggressively, $20 billion a year. It's all magical thinking to sort of claim, there'll be gas on fire coming out of your water taps and you'll die of cancer from fracking, or there'll be earthquakes. It's just not the case. And anybody who looks at the science knows it's not the case. And we're leaving money, massive money on the table that we can't afford until we get that going. Genetically modified crops, that's at least $5 billion a year for allowing the academy to get going. And by the way, golden rice, a genetically modified crop, which is banned by the European Union, and therefore banned in all sorts of places like Africa where you have to go along with European rules in order to sell your produce into the European Union. Golden rice has the potential to save about 500,000 people a year from going blind, and yet it's banned by the European Union. So this is not just an economic thing. It's a moral thing, in my opinion, and it's again magical thinking to assert that genetically modified crops are dangerous. Although, dump HS2, I threw $5 billion a year in for that. Although, remember, I'm spending another $80 billion on things like infrastructure. So some of this is going back into proper things, but not HS2. I've just saved, if you buy my list, $120 billion a year. You can knock a few of my things off and add your own things. But I've just eliminated the deficit. So it's not impossible. We could do this, but we'd have to stop thinking magically and start thinking rationally, logically, scientifically about some of these things. And somehow solving all 6 of these horsemen is a massive task. Can't go through it because all of your stomachs are rumbling. So I apologize for that. But you've all got a sense of what has to be done in order to get rid of these 6 horsemen. And if you do, I think you've got capitalism back, and an economy that'll grow, and jobs that'll grow, and wages that will grow. As you leave, there'll be little cards that you can pick up with that on, talking about some of these ideas and books that talk about them, and books talk about other things. But that's my lot. Thank you.